here today. My name is Georgie and I am the National Manager of Advocacy and Industry Development for Bioenergy Australia. Bioenergy Australia is the industry body for the bioenergy and bioproduct sectors in Australia, and we unashamedly push for growth and development in this sector. So many will know that Australia is a fair bit behind other nations, so we're really interested to run today's event and hear about what is happening in other areas and where we can leapfrog into those sectors here in Australia. So part of my role is to work closely with all of our member working groups, including the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance of Australia and New Zealand. And it's that group that brings you today's webinar on sustainable aviation fuel taking off globally. We'll be hearing from both the producers and users of SAF and exploring what we need to do to get SAF up to scale. So although I shouldn't have favourites, I've got to say that this is one of my favourite areas to work with in Bioenergy Australia. And I think that's because it's an area where bioenergy absolutely holds the answer to a big global problem. So that's really exciting. At this point, I'm really pleased to let you know that Bioenergy Australia has just commissioned a report that will closely examine Australia's future sustainable aviation fuel industry and what needs to be done to bridge the price gap between what consumers are happy to pay and what it actually costs to make that viable. So it's looking at the responsibilities of governments, of the consumers, of airports, of airlines, and so on, in order to make that industry viable. So that's just been commissioned yesterday, and we really look forward to sharing the results of that report with you in the coming months. For today's webinar, I'd really like to thank A4ANZ and Emma Wilson, their Director of Policy and Advocacy, and for their support and in co-hosting this webinar. I'd also like to thank Heidi Kaup, who is the Sustainability Manager at Boeing, for her assistance in bringing it all together. A few housekeeping matters, and I'm going to pass you on to Mark Augustiniewicz, and he can correct me on that pronunciation later. I did my best, Mark. And Mark, I'll pass you on to Mark, who has been curating this event. Mark is also from Boeing. So a few housekeeping things. Can I just ask that everyone mutes their microphones and turns off their camera? This is just to limit the distraction caused by your beautiful faces. If you do have any questions, we just encourage you to pop those in the comments function, the chat function, which is in the top right-hand bar of your screen. You can submit questions there at any time, and Mark will consider your questions as he guides the panel throughout the webinar. And please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. We will be making it available to all registrants and anyone who may have missed the event on our YouTube channel after the event. So thank you once again for joining us. I will now pass you to Mark, who will introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very proud to be here and really proud to be hosting such a great set of panels. I wish we could all be in person. Hopefully next time we have this group together, we can. My last holiday pre-pandemic was actually in Australia, so can't wait to get back and visit more of your great country. So as mentioned before, I'm from Boeing. I'm from the newly created Global Enterprise Sustainability Organization, and my background is more on the environment side and specifically focusing on our products and our products in use and achieving the industry goals for reducing CO2. We at Boeing, along with other industry experts, especially the ATAG Waypoint 2050 analysis of how we're going to get to those goals, have highlighted sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, as a major lever to pull on achieving those targets. And we're a huge proponent of SAF since the earliest days. And we've recently committed to making all of our production aircraft capable of flying on 100% SAF by 2030. So as we mentioned before, although there's great strides in sustainable aviation fuel and they've come a long way, it still represents just a small fraction of the global aviation fuel supply. And so the real hope and intent of this event is that people will get a better understanding of both the challenges and opportunities on how we can get sustainable aviation fuel production scaled. So mentioned before, today we're going to really approach it from two sides of the commercial aviation equation, from both the demand side and the supply side. And hopefully, by looking at this from both ways, we could figure out what's working, what could be better, and what more could be done. So with that, enough of me talking. I'll get to the interesting people and let them talk. I'll do a quick introduction of who is on our demand panelists, and then each of them have prepared some remarks. So we'll go through those and then follow around and ask them some more detailed questions. So our first panelist is David Young, Executive Manager of Sustainable and Future Planet at Qantas. We have Eddie Rutgers, Senior Manager, Procurement Operations at Air New Zealand. Grace Chung, Head of Public Engagement and Sustainability at Cathay Pacific. Marianne Chalky, Director of Environmental Affairs at Alaska Airlines, my home airline. And Ulster Bullock, Head of Operations of Strategy at Etihad, who I believe is going to be joining us virtually via video due to time zones. So with that, David, take us away.
Pictures and voice. Thanks very much for the opportunity and welcome everyone to the call. It's fantastic to have this chance. I guess I think you gave a great summary of where we're at. From a Qantas perspective, because we're a long haul carrier and even domestically long distance carrier, SAF is going to be the most critical thing that we can do over the next 10 to 15 years to get our emissions down. The idea of new technologies is great, but they're probably not going to meet this type of aircraft and the type of flying we're doing. So for us, SAF is absolutely the most critical thing on our radar at the moment, and has certainly, I think interestingly, in the last probably month, has bubbled up towards, if not the top, but certainly in the top 2 or 3 issues that the board are contemplating and looking to further understand, which is great. The challenge has been that I've gone from a space of not trying to knock down doors to trying to shut doors now because they've all swallowed the SAF Kool-Aid, and why can't we have it now? So the answer to that question is, we're talking about in this part of the world in Australia about creating an industry that doesn't currently exist. So that in itself creates challenges, but I think one of the most exciting things, and often isn't the case, particularly for people building out investment cases, is that we have a ready supply of customers willing, obviously at the right commercial terms, to take the product. So that's unusual for new and emerging technologies. I think that there is already a demand in place. So for us, what are we focused on? We are absolutely focused on getting probably a minimum of 4, possibly even 6 SAF facilities built in Australia to serve our domestic needs, and Qantas, 70% of our emissions, or a large number of our emissions, come from our domestic flying, which is quite significant. So we need to have a solution in this part of the world which isn't importing, and picking up SAF in overseas locations for inbound flying is scratching the surface, not dealing with the fundamental issue. So for that, we're looking to find the right industry-led partnerships to try and start to build a coalition of the willing to, I think, then take forward to government a realistic opportunity, which we will ultimately need the federal government to play a role in. There is no way that I've certainly seen from, and I'd be interested in international views, but yeah, the elephant in the room is we can do all we want with funding a little bit ourselves, getting other corporates to pay, getting consumers to pay, but ultimately there's a large chunk of the delta that's going to need to come from some form of government incentive to get the industry up and running. So that's our broad vision. We hope to be able to have SAF in Australia, Australian-made SAF, by the middle of this decade. That's the objective we've set ourselves, and therefore those who might supply us, and then to be able to sort of ramp that up over time. So that's sort of where we're at. It's our number 1 priority. We see great opportunity. We see also, I think it's a really unique opportunity for airlines to work closer together on this as well, which, hopefully we can do through bodies like this. It's not a branding exercise where one might want to take an advantage over an alternate carrier. I mean, we're all going to need to be in this to get the volume to make the economics work. So I'm excited from that point of view, being able to have much more constructive conversations with colleagues across the industry to help us drive for solutions that make sense for the whole of the industry, not just for one carrier. But you need the big carriers in our market, us, and New Zealand. I'm sure Eddie will talk about that as well. But you need that critical mass to start, and that's what we're out there saying we do. We've committed to spend $50 million, an initial $50 million on the development of the industry in Australia. We all know that that won't go far on current price premiums, but and it probably needs to have at least one more zero on the end of that. But it's a start and something we're keen to really use as a kickstart to help getting the industry up and running. And the other key piece for us is really working with state governments to help develop localised solutions, because I think the feedstock solutions for Australia may well differ by state, rather than there's not a one solution that's going to fit everything. So in a climate like ours, where there's a lot of marginal land and not a lot of rain, are there other opportunities to use some of that land for SAF cropping that might otherwise not be used, and certainly not diverting from food crops? That's a quick summary for me. Hand it back to you, August.
Yep, great. Thanks. Thanks for those great comments. So next, want to turn over to hear from Air New Zealand.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. So my name's Eddie Rutchers. You would have seen Senior Manager Procurement, and that seems a strange role to be talking about SAF, but I guess my background is I've been working now for 5 years within Air New Zealand and New Zealand, and sort of trying to crack the SAF supply question. And I'll share some of those findings with you today. So a little bit of context. I mean, New Zealand is an island nation. We've got large tracts of ocean between ourselves and our nearest neighbours, let alone the US and Asia. So air transport is absolutely critical to New Zealand's export investment and tourism industries. This has been very much reinforced over recent times with the COVID-19 pandemic. Because obviously tourism fell away, we realise the damage that does, but also importantly, being a sort of a food basket to the world, it's critical that we maintain open freight lanes for our primary production sector, and the only viable way to do that is through air transport. So very, very critical to New Zealand. COVID-19 has also, as you could imagine, had a major impact on Air New Zealand. We are an airline after all, and traffic numbers are well down. But it has not slowed our commitment to reducing emissions. In fact, we're amping up somewhat. We've identified decarbonisation across our network as a key strategic pillar, with the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. So we're absolutely committed to resolving all the issues that stand between us and the supply of SAF. We have been and we remain committed to working constructively with government and others in the aviation and private sectors to achieving those goals. We have done a lot of work in everything but SAF. So, you know, we've worked on sort of ways of shutting down APUs. We've worked on flight path optimization. We've got very new fleet of aircraft. We've pulled all the levers we can. And we are very much looking at new generation aircraft, so electric power, hydrogen power, and some of those will suit New Zealand very well with our abundance of renewable energy. However, those technologies are well down the horizon. We maybe see some next-gen aircraft by 2030 on our network, but none of those options will suit long-haul flying, right? So if we want to go to LA, we're not going to be doing it on an electric or a hydrogen-powered aircraft soon. We absolutely believe that in the medium to long-term, SAF is really the only current option to decarbonise for that long-haul route. So sort of that's the background, and then you know, similar to the Qantas story, I mean, 60% of our fuel uplift, though, is domestic, right? So we have a fairly significant domestic network, and obviously we refuel our planes before they head offshore. So we really do need access to SAF in New Zealand, and there is no industry currently that can do that. So over the past 5 years, as I've been saying, I've been working on that. We've been working with a number of stakeholders across a number of research projects looking at the viability of standing up a SAF industry in New Zealand. And all of that research, I think we've sort of generated about 3 business cases over that 5 years. We have demonstrated that there is a viable pathway to establishing SAF in New Zealand. We have established that there are broad social and economic benefits, both in region and nationally and internationally, and also that SAF will lead to a sort of a emission reduction by up to 85% compared to traditional jet fuel. So all of the indicators say it can be done and it is beneficial. However, like every other airline, the highest initial cost of establishing a SAF industry and producing the product means it has a price premium compared to traditional fossil fuel, and it's quite a significant premium. So very much more expensive than fossil fuel, even when you include the cost of carbon offset as an alternative. When you look around the world and where is SAF being produced and sold commercially in a commercially viable way, that's in markets that have some sort of support for the product. So where we've landed at the moment is that we need to do more research, particularly around feasibility studies, policy frameworks and investment frameworks if we're ready to be serious about establishing a SAF market. We're very much promoting the establishment of a public-private partnership that sort of sets up a decarbonisation advisory body similar to the Jet Zero Council in the UK. Now what that does is marshals a lot of forces together and allows coordination and development of policy and investments needed to support SAF, as well as other opportunities like, as I say, new gen aircraft. Feasibility study, as I say, we've done 3 business cases which have been sort of what I would call pseudo feasibility studies. We've sort of dug into it. We've worked with a lot of credible producers and people across the value chain, and we have a fairly good handle on it, but nothing beats the deep dive saying this is actually what the CapEx is, this is actually what the OpEx is, this is actually what feedstock agreements look like and offtake agreements look like. So we're very much now focused on that level of work to get there. We're also in New Zealand, you may be aware that there has been some discussion, and soon it will go for public consultation around a SAF mandate in New Zealand. It's wrapped up in a transport mandate. We're very much supportive of the notion of a SAF mandate in New Zealand. We believe a mandate creates certainty for investors and producers to invest in New Zealand. But the cautionary note there is a mandate on its own doesn't solve the problem for airlines. There needs to be, as I said earlier, sort of policies and funding mechanisms which close the commercial gap. Notwithstanding all of that, there is actually very good momentum in New Zealand. The government is, as I said, currently considering a biofuels mandate, and there is certainly a growing acknowledgement of the criticality of SAF to aviation and New Zealand's export and tourism sectors. We remain interested at an international level of securing SAF uplift volumes, but that market is equally challenging through onerous commercial conditions and lack of supply. However, what is encouraging is that when you look at the forecast growth in SAF production, it's sort of rising. If you took a sort of a midterm view, 80 million litres this year to close to 3 billion litres in 2025, although that is still just about 1% of the global jet fuel uplift at that time. So it's, but good growth, but still a very, very small percentage. So when we sort of wrap all of that up, it is our belief that material aviation decarbonisation, that is to a level that sort of meets global standards of success, will not be possible in New Zealand without all sectors of the value chain collaborating effectively to develop the required policy and commercial frameworks that will ultimately lead to investment in infrastructure build. It is therefore imperative that both the public and private sector remain committed to solving the myriad of issues that are common in standing up any new industry, and collectively maintain the tenacity and courage to make the tough decisions, because there are a lot of tough decisions to be made by everybody in the value chain if we are to actually build that infrastructure in New Zealand. However, if we get through that, if we can collaborate effectively, and if we do it with the right will, such an approach will ensure SAF supply in New Zealand that will maintain and enhance climate and economic benefit for all sectors of society. So we believe it is not only possible, it is a reality today, and we will continue to push forward. So that's sort of where we're at on it. Back to you, Mark.
Great, thank you for your opening remarks, and really resonated with both what you were mentioning and also what David was saying, is that it really isn't going to be, one airline or even one region. It's going to be, the entire industry, and reaching out to maybe even some non-traditional parts of the world to really work together to really pull this forward. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Cathay Pacific Airways to have their comments.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. I'm Grace from Cathay Pacific. I just noticed that for including Cathay and all the airlines actually talking this morning, we have all set our own net zero carbon emissions target around the 2050 timeline. And we are just among the other, maybe another 30 plus airlines around the world who have set ourselves this voluntary goal to reach net zero in the next 30 years to come. And I think for those of us on the panel from the airline industry would know, and Mark can ascertain to that, I think it's the consensus of the industry that while there are exciting new aircraft design and sort of like alternatively powered aircraft, sort of like the new technology being developed, for long-haul operations, talking about the cross-oceans flights that for Australia and New Zealand definitely needed, and for the type of operations Cathay Pacific mainly in with the double aisle, twin aisle, large aircraft carrying like 200, 300 passengers for such long-haul flights, the only viable solution in the next 30 years is only SAF. So while the other developments of technology is very important, and we look forward to those being a solution maybe from 2060 or 2070 onwards, for us to meet our net zero emissions goal, SAF is a must. And as a global airline based in Hong Kong, we need to make sure that not only there is SAF available from our home base, but there's also SAF available wherever our aircraft flies around the world. And that's why it brings me here to the forum, and just to share with you all why it's important for us as well for the SAF supply chain to take off in both Australia and New Zealand, because you are our important market as well. We're one of the biggest foreign airline operating international flights into Australia before COVID. And we look forward to coming back very soon. And for the many years to come, we hope that we can have the SAF supply from this market as well. For what Cathay's role have been in the SAF space, we were one of the pioneer as the first airline investor for one of the leading SAF producers, Fulcrum Bioenergy, based in the US. And our offtake agreement with them is enough to cover about 2% of our annual fuel requirement for over a 10 years period, as soon as their production capacity, sort of like goes into the delivery phase. But that's quite far from enough from reaching a net zero emissions target. So we are continuously working with looking for opportunities to work with new partners around the world, supplementary to our network. I think the last point I would like to make here is that, echoing what David and Eddie already mentioned, is very important that it's a joint effort. Airline cannot do it alone. After all, we just operate the aircraft, and it needs both the regulators to provide a stable, long-term, and supportive policy for supporting the development of the whole SAF supply chain locally, and also the supply side, which we'll hear more from them at the second part of the panel, to really go into the investment and scale up the production. For us to be able to meet those targets, all these things need to happen quite fast. So we look forward to more of this kind of conversation to take place, and look forward to take part in even the next step when we take it to the actual discussion of bringing it to reality. Thank you.
Great, thanks for sharing your comments. It's great to learn about all the things that Cathay Pacific is doing, even up into actually investing in producers. So it was great to hear. Now I'd like to throw it over to my corner of the world, to Alaska Airlines.
All right. My name is Marianne Shockey. I'm with Alaska Airlines, Director of Environmental Affairs, and we'll kind of take it to a different part of the world. So what we do at Alaska is we basically are flying in North America. We have some flights that go to Mexico and Costa Rica, but basically North American flying. And what we've looked at is kind of what many of the other folks have been talking about, is policy is huge. It's a key in helping us to invest. And on the West Coast, we had the low carbon fuel standard, which ended up successfully including jet fuel many years ago in California. And now you have Oregon and now Washington State contemplating, and also British Columbia. That is a huge help in signaling and helping get started with other SAF production on the West Coast. The other thing that Alaska really looked at and continues to look at is spend versus invest. Do you try and spend your way out of this, or do you invest in technologies that help you not even expend jet fuel to begin with? Do you look at different ways with RNP? I think you folks saw the announcement today with Flyways. It'll give us additional efficiencies on flight. And we also look at other ways in looking at electric aircraft. I know that doesn't work for long haul, but we are really looking at that from a perspective of being in the Pacific Northwest and some of the shorter haul flights. Will it be here in time? I don't know. Is there infrastructure? I don't know. But we're looking into these different things, and it's taking everybody to do that. On a national level in the United States, we had the work together with both the producers and the other airlines in ensuring a blender's tax credit. I'm sure others will talk about this later on. But that's huge for the producers to be able to show that the jet fuel and the SAF will be available for us. We've also signed on to the Amazon Climate Pledge. So that's a net zero by 2040. So we're on a little bit of a hurry up schedule on trying to look for additional efficiencies. One of the issues that we also are reviewing is when we get these, we have a lease agreement with the Port of Seattle. That lease agreement also has somewhat of a SAF mandate listed in there. And it was to signal production for SAF in the Pacific Northwest. And while we don't think we will meet, that in the current time frame and getting that production, we also looked at other ways where we could meet that emission reduction in other ways around the airport. And like others have said, you're looking at electrification of ground equipment, single engine taxi, APU reductions, and tracking all of those mechanisms so that you can look and still get the emission reductions that SAF would bring you. And lastly, what we're looking at is really just market and to be able to show that we would have additional offtake agreements that would be longer offtake agreements so that we could basically, in essence, hedge. So we would know what that additional cost would be, because the SAF is more expensive than traditional jet. And to look at it from a financial aspect and investing in a system or an offtake agreement that will help us know what our future is, so there's not that volatility up and down, because we believe that the carbon offsets will become more volatile as things progress. That's kind of where we stand. I don't think I missed anything. We also work with Boeing, and our deliveries of the MAX have all been with SAF. So that's been a fun project as well. So thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing Alaska's experience. Proud MVP member. So all the good work that you're doing there.
Thank you, Mark.
Lastly, I will be hearing from on this panel from Etihad, and I believe we have that as a pre-recording, correct? There we go.
Is anyone else struggling with sound with this one?
Yeah, no sound.
Yep, none.
No.
None.
Yeah, usually you have to share, specifically share the sound as well, otherwise it doesn't come through.
Wondering, Mark, if maybe we could go to a different speaker and Lauren can have a look and see whether she can access the audio file separately for that one.
Yeah. So actually, it brings us to the Q&A portion, which is great. Hearing from all the different airlines and their experiences they've had, one thing that seemed to be a common thread was really this need for government, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more on the supply side, to provide the incentives in order to get this small emerging industry up and running so that SAF can be produced at the volumes that are needed. It also came out that a lot of their experiences have been that it really isn't necessarily always at the federal level, but actually at the more local, the state and regional level is where they're seeing the most uptake and the most action on the side of government. So I want to just throw the question out there because I don't know what the answers are. If you have any experience actually helping engaging the actual consumer, the customer, the flying public, to one, not only educate them on SAF, but maybe two, mobilize them in their local politics to maybe help support those things. So I don't know if anyone's had experience doing that, or if that's a viable solution, but would love to hear the panel's thoughts on
that. David from Qantas, I'll jump in on that. We've started thinking about the consumer piece, but because we don't have SAF available, it's sort of you don't want to go too early and you lose any real momentum. I think you've hit on something quite important, Mark. I mean, the comms piece is hard. We've had quite a successful carbon offset program, consumer based, for a number of years, but even that is constant. There's a constant need to keep explaining to people what a carbon offset is, and that the projects are valid and appropriate, and that the airline's not just taking the money as an extra ancillary revenue source. I think when you then start to add sustainable aviation fuel on top of that, the messaging gets harder if you start getting into how it's made and the hundreds of different feedstocks. So I think at a basic marketing level, and I'm not a marketer, it's sort of saying to passengers, would you pay a premium if the fuel we used was 80% less emitting than today? And I think most people would say yes, they would. How much that premium is, we don't know. And increasingly, I think the great work that Alaska did with Microsoft and that United have just announced, and I think KLM were the first to sort of kick that off with trying to get corporates on side, is something also that's going to be quite critical, particularly corporates that are making super profits like banks and in our case miners and others. I think building that connection to Scope 3 emissions and how we can solve for companies' Scope 3s if they help us solve for our Scope 1s.
That's great. Marian, do you want to talk a little bit about the Alaska relationship?
Yeah, that'd be great.
With Microsoft? Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. I agree with David. You know, a lot of us have had offset programs that the customer could, you know, click on something or click elsewhere and offset their flight. But trying to explain that and the actual uptick is not very good. And the success that we've had has really come from our corporate customers requesting and asking in these types of situations, what can you do to help? What can we do? How can we get this going? And being very collaborative in that space. And that's what made the Microsoft deal really, I would say like a precedent, because they were helping us to solve both their problem and our problem, and look at a way that we could structure this. And I think we're going to find more and more of that happening, as you see, from the corporate customer and the corporate side. And in that way, I hope that then, you know, filters down into the everyday traveler, if you will, to be able to want to do that.
Hi, if I may supplement, this is Grace from Cathay. I think just want to echo what David and Marianne has said, but I think what's also we noted is the similar level of interest from cargo freight shippers. So whether it's Apple or other businesses, so making good money, and they have also made commitment to meet the science-based target that kind of like only accept in-sector decarbonization, and that they commit to not only reduce their own emissions at Scope 1 level, but going to cover their Scope 3 emissions. We see lots of interest from that space, and we are exploring something similar to what Alaska has achieved with Microsoft as well. And I think that would be quite an important force to drive further uptake of SAF forward. But having said that, it still can't replace what we need from the regulatory side to really get the policy there.
And just do a quick check if we've got to try the audio again, or should we press on to some more questions?
Lauren, having had any luck with the audio? I haven't resolved it yet, sorry.
No worries. So to follow on, one of the questions in the prompt, so probably more targeted at folks that have had direct experience purchasing and operating with SAF on the airline side, but if there's one thing that you could go back in time and do differently, what would that be? What was a hard lesson that you would change if you could about how you either engaged or how you kind of thought about the business case, or what assumptions you had about SAF?
I could take that one really quickly in looking at some of the offtake agreements and discussions with SAF producers. I think one of the things, if I look back on it, is really the last mile to the airport. And you want to do these great things and you want to purchase the sustainable aviation fuel, but at the end of the day, how do you really get it there into the fuel farms? And what is the best way? What's the most efficient way, sustainable way to do that? And I think we are still all studying that, but that is something that proved to be more difficult than what I would have envisioned when we first started the discussions.
Thank you for sharing that. So we've got a couple questions here in the chat. So we've got one here is around feedstocks. So SAF is from different feedstocks. For the panelists, who mentioned paying a SAF premium, how do you expect this to develop and why? I guess more of, do you see any feedstocks or any supply that seems to, it has a better chance of coming down the cost curve quicker? I think that's what they're probably getting at. Or is it kind of all, it's all one kind of industry for you folks?
Yeah, I'll make a comment on that. So I mean, from a feedstock perspective, the cost of the feedstock, the logistics, and the conversion of that to something you can turn into fuel is the underlying cost driver for SAF. And you sort of look at that and say, well, that's driving up the cost of SAF. But then you've got to look long term and say, well, governments generally aren't going to subsidise anything forever either. There's got to be a commercial reality at some point. So there's current technologies that the work sort of says that they're quite expensive. You can somewhat mitigate that by volume, so it's just by producing more out of the same plants, leveraging the infrastructure, which is pretty standard way, I think, of getting some benefit. There's emerging technologies which we think over time will be quite useful in driving down the cost of feedstock. And there's also, I guess, the opportunity over time to sort of create competing markets for feedstock, if you looked at it from a purely commercial sense. All of those things play a role. Whether they ever get, if you like, back down to the notional, same price as a barrel of oil today, fossil oil today, don't know, but we think there is material gains to be made by pulling all of those levers over time.
Great, thanks for that. And so someone else have anything to say on that one? Or we have one other question here that is looking at how to get other. Oh, Grace, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I think to supplement a bit on that, actually there are at least 7 approved pathways already. So different technology to produce SAF at the moment, and more are being developed, and they all use different feedstock. And depending on the different types of technology, the cost driver is actually different. So for example, Fulcrum, the company Cathay invested in, they use municipal solid waste, so basically rubbish, as their feedstock to produce SAF. So actually they don't need to pay for expensive feedstock, but actually they got paid to take care of the waste. But of course, then their cost driver become something else. Is the technology itself is more expensive to run, etc. And they still need to test the industrial scale production, the yield level, etc. So I would say different types of technology each has their own cost driver and their own sort of like upcoming technical hurdles need to go through before they become large-scale production. And definitely when the production scale comes up, economy of scale logic kicks in and the price would come down over time. But I think definitely that's the direction to go.
And just to follow on to what Grace said, that's why it's so important to continue investing in research for feedstocks, to continue that supply chain, to have it be as big as possible.
Yes, and I would say we are still at this very early stage of SAF, that although some technology pathways is already there, definitely there are still plenty of room to for further research and investment to explore what are the alternative feedstock, alternative way of production, making it more efficient, so to bring the whole efficiency up and bring the productivity up. And so I think it's still, we are kind of early in the in the journey, and it would be of tremendous sort of like a guaranteed uptick. It's sort of like from the demand for airlines around the world. So I think it's a very promising market for our friends from the supply chain to look into further.
You're on mute, Mark.
Thanks. I think I figured this out after a year and a half. So a question in the chat also around what airlines are doing as an industry outside of the leaders who are here, who are the ones who are making the investments, who are out there talking with the regulators and the policymakers to change things. Obviously, in this region, this organization that we're here today with Stefan's doing is really a great thing to bring all those other airlines together that maybe are smaller operators and don't necessarily have all the resources to go through these things. Boeing is a great proponent of the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Users Group. There's similar organizations in different regions around the world, but I guess a question I'll put out for the airlines that are here are, most of you, if not all of you, are members of co-chair partner alliances and such. Is there any discussion happening at that level, or is it still pretty much at the individual airline level and how you're kind of achieving your own personal company targets?
Happy to comment on that. So for Air New Zealand, our primary focus, because the majority of our fuel is uplifted in New Zealand, our focus is very much around New Zealand-based supply. Now, and I talked in my opening remarks about a sort of a public-private partnership, and we absolutely understand that while we might be a large airline in New Zealand, there are many other airlines that fly in and out of New Zealand and operate within New Zealand. And that's the whole purpose of the public-private partnership, is to bring everybody together through the value chain. So airports, airlines, producers, fuel companies, to bring them all together into one group so that we can collaborate on the best way to do it. Internationally, to be fair, you know, when you're a single flight a day into San Francisco, you're going to be a fast follower on whatever happens in that port rather than try and make something happen yourself. So.
Great, thank you for that answer. Checking the chat, I think that is most of the questions that are there. Does anyone have any last minute questions they wanted to post? And we can definitely circle back if something occurs to folks later on during the day. We're a little ahead of schedule, but I think that's okay. So it's about 10 to the top of the hour, depending which hour, depends on where you are right now. But why don't we take a 10-minute break is what we have scheduled to go refresh your coffee or water or your beverage of choice, and be back here at the top of the hour, and then we'll kick off the supply discussion. All right. Well, hopefully everyone is getting back from break and getting back online here. So at this point, I'd like to kick off our next panel, which is going to focus on the supply side of the SAF equation. And so we're going to start off by hearing from Patrick Gruber, CEO at Gevo Incorporated, and then on to Jimmy Samaritis, CEO and Board of Director at LanzaTech, Ariana Baldo, Sector Lead of Aviation at RSB, David Harris, Director of Energy Technologies at CSIRO, and finally, Paul Bennett, with Clean Technology Science Leader at Scion and Chair of IEA Bioenergy. So with that, we'll kick it off with Patrick.
Hey, everybody. It's good to see people from Australia again and the other colleagues from around the world. So Gevo is a company who's takes the approach of using residual carbohydrates, converting them into jet fuel. And we can also make gasoline or diesel fuel, whatever, but jet fuel is a pretty nice molecule. We have been proving the technology and operating a small plant for many, many years. We are now in the midst of the design and build out of a big plant that we call Net Zero 1. It'll be up in Lake Preston, South Dakota. It is going to have a capacity of 45 million gallons per year. It's pre-sold under take-or-pay contracts. It's pretty interesting. I think we'll wind up selling about half of it for SAF. It'll have the overall carbon footprint, according to the Argonne GREET model, will be a -5 on a full life cycle basis, because along the way, we're capturing carbon and paying attention to it. And this plant will be built off the grid. We're eliminating all fossil resources. And this is a fundamental point. In order to drive carbon scores really low, you have to get rid of the fossil carbon across the business systems. You have to, because that's what drives up the footprint. And of course, then the capital costs can be very high. And so you'll see our capital costs high, operating costs very low. So in my perspective of the issues around these things, it's all about managing the capital cost and building it. All of us have technologies that can get there and compete with petroleum. It's paying back all that new capital. I mean, that petroleum industry is all depreciated out. We have a interesting customer pipeline of over about 500 million gallons in contract negotiation. What's interesting is the flavor of who's buying has changed. It's true that we have Delta, Trafigura, SAS, Air Total, Avfuels, and many others who have contracted product from us. It's changed though. It's going to energy companies. And so in these big volumes that we're seeing coming down the pike, it's all about the energy companies. And they're the ones who are going to solve the supply chain problems of how to bring it to the airports and all the rest. So we're at this cusp where in the States and in Europe, I think we've already crossed over into the realm of where it's economical. There is, of course, value for carbon that can be monetized. That helps. That is what causes it to work. And we see that in Australia, and we've looked at Australia many times, the abundance of renewable resource. It has great potential. You know, we're standing here ready, willing, and able. We got to put the whole business system together and figure out how to skin the cat on the overall capital cost. I will say this, one thing that is true and something you'll see us doing is that we're huge believers in that driving these carbon scores down really, really low and negative is going to be really important. It's got to be really well documented, proven all the way through, monitored, because no one believes it. Really, we run into so much skepticism about all these carbon scores, and people play games. It can't be game playing. So we've established a blockchain technology to track things. We intend to track things all the way from wherever the carbon is sourced through the whole production process with a mix of energy, with all the process energy, and just lay it out transparently. That's what we intend to do, and we'll have it all certified and audited. And we've even done a pilot program like that with RSB and ISCC. And so that's what we intend to do. So it's a interesting game. I think it has changed in the last 2 years. It's now about building things big, and absolutely it can be done. So I'll stop right there.
Great, thanks for sharing. Great to hear about the scaling, which is what's always just around the corner. So it's glad to see that it is now there and it's happening. So great. We'll turn it over to Jimmy.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Can you guys see me okay? I somehow lost my own self-image, but hopefully you guys can see me okay.
Yeah,
I can see you fine.
Excellent. Well, listen, thanks for having me on this morning there. It's evening here in Chicago. It's great to be a part of this. I'll start by saying that Australia and New Zealand are both very close to our hearts at LanzaJet and at LanzaTech. I think some of you may know, but LanzaTech was founded in New Zealand and is still a New Zealand company. So we have a long history going on 16 years in New Zealand, and we've also begun engagement in Australia. So I'm excited to be here to chat with you today about our story at LanzaJet, which is a company that actually spun out of LanzaTech about a year ago. Actually, on May 28th, we celebrate our 1-year anniversary of having spun out. And it was done very intentionally so that we can accelerate the commercialization of our technology, which is an alcohol-to-jet technology. We start with ethanol, which is a great feedstock because it is widely available across the globe. And in partnership with LanzaTech, which has scaled up its technology, which is a gas fermentation technology and can use waste sources as the feedstock to produce a sustainable ethanol. And that gives us the opportunity to actually deploy our technology on a global basis and access feedstock that is available locally and transported throughout the region. What I will tell you, though, for myself personally, there's a lot of familiar faces on this call and folks that I got to know more than a decade ago. And in fact, I think Pat Gruber and I had breakfast maybe about 10 years ago, a long while ago, discussing SAF and the possibilities for the industry. I come from United Airlines, where I led a lot of our efforts in renewable fuels and SAF and on sustainability policy. And that started back in 2008. And in some ways, over the ensuing 13 years, a lot has changed. Some things have not yet changed, but I am quite encouraged about where things stand today. I think technology is ready and is scaling. We're seeing that across the globe with various technologies, not just ours, but others as well. You have governments that are participating and that are putting in place the right mechanisms, with more work to do, though, to support the scale up of technology. You have financial institutions that are very keen, very interested in investing in ESG type companies and projects. Customers who are very much keen on living and flying more sustainably, and corporate customers that are putting in place net zero ambitions and pressure on airlines to fly more sustainably. And certainly airlines, as we heard here today, are advancing their net zero ambitions forward. Not even 2050, but sooner than that. So a lot is happening that, in my view at least, is creating an inflection point for the industry. And I think a lot will happen over the next couple of years. A bit about our company. We've been, as I said, we spun out from LanzaTech a year ago, but the technology has been in development for more than 10 years. It started with the U.S. Department of Energy, and we've been scaling it up from lab to pilot to demo. And we're now in the process of building our commercial scale facility in the state of Georgia here in the United States. Our pathway is ASTM approved. That was in 2018. We've completed commercial flights with Virgin Atlantic and ANA. And we're very actively building the company at this point. What I will share with you is, the approach that we took in spinning out the company was done very intentionally so that we can scale the technology across the globe. We have a great group of investors. We have Suncor, which is a Canadian-based integrated energy company. Mitsui, which is nearly a couple hundred years old, based in Japan, heavily involved in various industries, and in particular in renewables. British Airways is one of our anchor investors, and Shell is our most recent investor. And certainly LanzaTech is our founder, and certainly by our side throughout all of this. We've also have additional funding from All Nippon Airways, ANA out of Japan. I mentioned this because these investors have not only invested in the company, but also in the development of our facility in Georgia. They've also committed to developing commercial scale projects across the globe in partnership with us. This gives us access to capital and enables us to scale up the technology at a fast pace. As I mentioned, we use ethanol, which is widely available, and we focus on low carbon and waste-based ethanol. Those supply chains continue to develop, and we're very actively working with companies across the globe to develop those supply chains, including in Australia. And we also use a standard size for our plants, which allows us to have a factor of repeatability in the design and engineering of the plants and deploying them at a faster clip, if you will, across the globe. Our goal that we set, that we've talked about publicly, is to have 100 million gallons a year of SAF in production by 2025. We are well on our way. So in addition to the project in Georgia, we have a project in Central Europe. It's called Flight, in partnership with LanzaTech and Sky Energy. That is a 13 million gallon a year facility that will supply SAF into Central Europe. We have projects with our investors that we are beginning to develop in Asia as well as North America. We've been quite heavily involved in New Zealand and working with Eddie and the team there on developing a roadmap to get to 2050. So from my perspective, as I mentioned, we're quite excited about all that's happening across the globe. In particular, we're excited about Australia and New Zealand. And above and beyond, many folks have mentioned the importance of policy. That is certainly true, right? Policy and government engagement, involvement, and support has been critical to our success with the partnership with the U.S. government. We also have received funding through LanzaTech in the UK to accelerate projects there through the Department for Transport. So it's clear that where there is government support and government funding, that is where technologies are being pulled in and being deployed. So it's an important building block for the industry. Overall, I think we're very excited about what's happening across the industry. For me personally, it's also quite exciting 13 years on to see the industry finally being developed. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat with you tonight. Over to you, Mark.
Great, thanks for sharing the LanzaJet story, and it's great to hear about all the unique collaborations you have going on around the world. Now we're going to switch it over to Ariana to talk about RSV.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ariana. I'm the sector lead for aviation at the RSP, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. I'm really sorry for not being able to participate live, but unfortunately the webinar is right in the middle of the night for me. So I thought I still want to share some thoughts with you via this recording. And I'm sure that we will be in touch in the near future to collaborate on SAF development in Australia and New Zealand. So we are definitely at a critical point in SAF market development nowadays. On one hand, the demand for SAF is growing fast, thanks to the commitment of leading airlines, many of which are participating today, and also an increasing number of corporate initiatives who are looking for solutions to address their Scope 3 emissions, and SAF could be a solution for them. Also, policies are put in place worldwide to support the scaling of SAF production by using targets, incentives, minimum requirement for SAF sustainability. And finally, producers, technology partners, investors are rising to the challenge to grow production from the current 400,000 tons of SAF a year to the nearly 6 million tons needed in order to meet the current offtake demand and also achieve IATA's goal of 2% SAF penetration in the jet fuel market by 2025. And of course, to also rise to the challenge to find sustainable feedstock for this production. So what role does the RSB play? The RSB is committed to support all stakeholders to ensure that these developments are founded on sound sustainability principles, to make sure that SAF meets its promise to achieve significant greenhouse gas emission reduction and avoid negative impacts on the environment, societies, and food security. We do this by engaging in projects to identify sustainable feedstock opportunities for SAF production, by creating platforms for stakeholders to engage on key sustainability challenges. And by stakeholders, I don't only mean industry players, but RSB proactively involves civil society also in our SAF discussion and our standard development. by supporting supply chain actors to understand and implement sustainability requirements in practice, and ultimately by also offering a sustainability certification that is recognized by both regulators, including EU RED and CORSIA, but also by environmental organizations such as the WWF, IUCN, and RDC, and the International Coalition for Sustainable Aviation. So in conclusion, we really look forward to working with you in Australia and New Zealand to support the development of truly sustainable SAF. And I also take the chance to thank again Bioenergy Australia for inviting me to attend this webinar, and to the many speakers that are participating today, including Boeing, Air New Zealand, Cathay Pacific, Gevo, and LanzaJet, for their commitment to RSV membership over the last few years. So enjoy the rest of the webinar, and I'm sure we will be in touch soon. Thank you and cheers.
Great, that was a really informative and great presentation, and glad to see we got the video working, so it works out great. Next, we're gonna switch it over and listen to and hear some remarks from David and CSIRO.
There we are. I think I'm here. Well, thank you, and it's a very interesting discussion already, and I'm really pleased to see the diversity that we've got in the inputs. But there's a lot of commonality, I think, in the challenges that we face. So my name's David Harris. I'm the research director for what we call our Energy Technologies program within CSIRO Energy. For those who don't know, CSIRO is Australia's national science agency. Staff of a bit over 5,000 staff across all of Australia. We have, I think, 55 laboratories at the moment across Australia, and we cover a very wide range of disciplines and industry sectors, from agriculture, manufacturing, minerals, energy, of course, where we are, including and space and medical and others. So very broad disciplines, and a really good platform for cross-sector collaboration. And that's particularly important for the sort of things that we're talking about here, as we talk about bringing different energy sources into processes which, in some cases, they're very mature technologies that are just not connected yet into other sectors. And the more we move to integrating renewable energy and renewable energy storage, which is really what we're talking about here, into these different sectors, the more opportunity there is, I think, to leverage the technologies and scale that already exist. And that's really going to be important as we try and make the differences we need in the timeframes we've heard about. So within the technologies program that we're running here, we are really about trying to find ways, if you like, to join the dots to create integrated solutions across important value chains. So we've got groups looking at thermal and electrochemical technologies, for example. We've heard a little about some of them already. And that includes things like electrolysis and fuel cells, gasification, pyrolysis, and gas systems and things, all of which would fit in here. And the differences all come down to the sources of energy. But as we know, many of those technologies are quite mature in the fossil fuel sector, have achieved scale. And the challenge for us is not necessarily to change the product too much. We know what jet fuel products need to be like, but we do need to change the inputs, and we need to change the emissions. So it's about how do we bring a more intractable input side into many of these processes, which we already know a lot about, but haven't been connected across the sectors. So quite a bit of our work is in how do we bring these different resources into play, either through a syngas type process or through electrochemical processes, and that includes conversion to hydrogen, conversion of CO2, and integration of hybrid type systems with electrochemical and thermal systems working together. We also have groups looking in detail at solar thermal technologies, for example, which is an important opportunity, particularly in Australia and certainly in the US, where thermal storage of energy is a really scalable, cost-effective mechanism for bringing renewable energy into processes that require heat. And that could be power, that could be chemical synthesis, it could be reforming of syngases and so forth. So solar thermal technology interface, I think, is something for the future, but more and more important. We also have programs on emissions and environmental aspects. It was interesting to hear some of the discussion around certification, carbon footprints. We have exactly the same issue as we're looking to develop export hydrogen, for example. Certifying that the hydrogen, if it goes into export fuels, is in fact green and does in fact have the pedigree that it needs to have and can be proven to provide the emissions benefits that it's there for. Likewise, quite a lot of work which has been going on for decades on CO2 capture, initially developed for fossil fuel applications, more and more now looking to be applied into process industry, steel making, concrete, cement making, etc. And in the instance of making fuels, how do we generate CO2 in a renewable way, or use recycled CO2 combined with renewable hydrogen to produce fuels? As I said, we don't need to change the product, but we need to change the source of the ingredients. And bringing all of those different sectors together is really the challenge, as I see it, for getting to scale and providing a platform that will then support the integration of some of the much newer innovations where we do have some significant changes in process, but they're not there at scale, and that we don't need to throw everything out to help get those technologies to scale. I think what the challenge we've got is achieving the synergies that we need to be able to move as quickly as we can, relying on the established and functioning technologies now, and providing a platform to enable that transition to be practical, to be scalable. It's no point investing in a process that is never going to give you the fuel commitment that one needs for a major ecosystem such as aviation. And the maritime sector faces similar challenges. So we need to make sure that we can leverage what we have at scale with a pathway to transition. So it's not all about new technology, but we need to provide the pathway for new technology, and we need to be able to do that by helping to transition what we have. So it's about synergy, scale and cost more than at the early stages about all new technology. And that's quite exciting. And that's, as we see some of the discussion developing today, how do we get those diverse feedstocks into a process that gives us the energy storage density we need, the transportability we need, and the efficiencies that we need to be able to operate something as complicated as an aviation sector. So Australia is looking to develop means for exporting renewable energy, stored either as hydrogen, ammonia, or what have you, as well as hydrocarbon. But it's obviously about managing the carbon footprint of those chains. So I think in the supply side, that to us is really the challenge. How do we take those intractable energy sources, integrate them into systems at scale, where possible, using those that we have already developed in agriculture, chemical, transport, and the fossil fuel sectors, so that we can support that transition in a bankable way, so that people can actually start to take it up at scale. So that's the challenge as far as I see it, and one of the things that we need, the missing links, is how do you connect sectors that haven't worked and spoken together before? And we're looking at concepts like research development, but most importantly, piloting and demonstration hubs to provide some of that infrastructure that will help technology developers bring and test their technology, but more importantly, see how they can align it with the value chains, with other parts of the technology chain we need, so that they can achieve that scale and address those barriers to entry which new technologies will face. So I'll leave it there. Happy to follow on any of those things in the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks for sharing your comments. Really resonated with the interdisciplinary approach to it. Definitely early days of corporate sustainability. There's no sustainabilitist or someone with a degree in sustainability back then. And even today, you still need people from finance, you need people from engineering, you need people from accounting, from all these different disciplines to actually make something happen. And just as you pointed out, to make sustainable aviation fuel work at large, not only different nodes within the industry that have never worked together, but different industries that have never worked together having to connect. So yeah, I really appreciate those points that you brought out. Paul, let's turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, good afternoon from New Zealand. It's great to be the last speaker. And in a position where a lot of the things I had planned to say have already been said. Obviously worked very closely with Air New Zealand. Eddie has already covered a lot of things. We've worked with LanzaTech, and Jimmy has covered some of the things I might like to say. And David, being from the research side, has also covered some of the key features that are important to us here at Scion. So Scion, what is Scion? Scion is the trading name for the Old Forest Research Institute. And Scion is actually quite an interesting word and quite an appropriate word for this embryonic industry, as Scion is a new shoot. So it's quite appropriate, as I said. We're a Crown Research Institute. That means we're basically owned by the government. We're owned by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, but we work very closely and for a lot of the other ministries. So Ministry of Transport, Ministry for the Environment, etc. And we have really good working relationships and get drawn into consultations for those folks. In this session, I'm standing in for Brian Cox, who's the Director of Bioenergy Association in New Zealand. I do sit on the board of the Bioenergy Association in New Zealand, but I'm also, for my sins, chair of the International Energy Bioenergy Group, and so work quite closely with the Bioenergy Association, Bioenergy Australia as well. Back a couple of years ago, we did a big study here in New Zealand with a lot of New Zealand stakeholders, industry, ministries, forest owners, etc., looking at what a large-scale bioenergy industry would look like for New Zealand. And we explored what the key features of that were going to be. And some of the main conclusions were that if we were going to produce biofuels at a reasonably large scale here in New Zealand, we needed to be focused on aviation and marine. The light duty sector, that was going to be electrified, but there really weren't any alternatives for aviation or marine sector, apart from sort of the short haul potential electrification. But for the long haul, for many years to come, liquid fuels were going to be important. In terms of what feedstocks we've got in New Zealand to produce liquid fuels, well, the most obvious feedstocks are woody biomass, either starting with residues from existing forest plantations, or starting to look at new species, new planting regimes, and shorter rotation type products. So that's an area that we felt was quite important for New Zealand to look at. But there were some key features of what a bioenergy or biofuels industry in New Zealand would look like, and there's some key challenges. And that's around the nature of our land. We don't have a huge amount of flat land. We have quite a lot of rolling hill country, and hence the focus on woody feedstocks. We have scales that aren't appropriate for some of the technologies that are being developed around the world. So New Zealand would not go down a heifer route, or it would be extremely unlikely that New Zealand would go down a heifer route. And we certainly wouldn't go down the route that the scales that other countries are looking at, like the Neste plants in Singapore, for instance. And so we'd be looking for a biofuels industry, but largely based on woody biomass, but would be distributed across New Zealand, with conversion factories located between the forests and the point of demand. As I said, we've worked very closely with Air New Zealand in the past and a range of other New Zealand stakeholders. We've also been talking with a range of technology providers from around the world as well, in conjunction with Air New Zealand and those other stakeholders. We participated in the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance of Australia and New Zealand. And as Eddie alluded to, the Jet Zero Council for New Zealand, we're a participant of that as well, or a future participant of that. I would say sort of until the turn of this year, talking about biofuels in New Zealand was like banging your head against a brick wall. There really wasn't any traction at ministry level. We are now starting to see a lot of interest. It probably started with the Climate Change Commission's draft advice to ministers at the back end of last year, saying that liquid biofuels were going to be important in New Zealand, and the focus ought to be around aviation and marine. We're now hearing every minister mention biofuels, and ministers in particular mentioning sustainable aviation fuels. The Prime Minister was here about 4 weeks ago, and one of the first, in her first state sentence, she mentioned biofuels for aviation. So there is a real traction here in New Zealand now. Part of the challenge will be managing the impatience of ministers, to be honest, but there is a real traction. So that's good, and we're in a place now that the Ministry of Transport is drafting a mandate for liquid biofuels, and this is all liquid fuels for transportation, but again, specific mention for aviation fuels. What that looks like at the moment is unclear. We're expecting a consultation document to be published in the next month or so. But as I said, a lot of momentum around the world. Some other things that are happening, obviously, that there's a lot of production already existing around the world. A lot of new technologies being developed. Just in the last few weeks, picked up on 2 new plants in France being becoming operational. Eddie shared with me this morning that the Dutch courts have told Shell that they need to move harder and faster in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from their own operations and products. I think Shell had originally proposed a 20% reduction in emissions by 2030. The Dutch government are telling them they need to deliver a 45% reduction. So lots of pressure, lots of momentum around this. And so I think, we're in a good place at the moment. Hopefully, development of policy will keep track of this momentum and will add to it. There are some key areas I think that we need to explore and continue to explore. One is around developing new feedstock opportunities, because I don't think our existing plantation forests will be able to deliver all the feedstocks that are required at the time, in the right time scale. I think we're going to start needing shorter rotation feedstock plays. We're going to have to better describe, I think, the socio-economic benefits of biofuels. A lot of the ministers keep coming back to the cost, and they need a handle to overcome the cost. They need to understand that it is beneficial to society, it's beneficial to New Zealand. What's the impact on GDP? What's the impact on jobs? So we need to get a better description of that, and we also need to understand the full sustainability piece as well. It's not just about greenhouse gases, it's sustainability of production of that feedstock. And the only other thing that is in my mind at the moment, and I think David mentioned it earlier, is around understanding how we can make this work. We're going to need new value chains. There's going to be new business models, and we need to really understand who's going to play what role in these value chains and business models. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mark.
Great, thanks for your comments. It's really great to hear that the national government in New Zealand is really getting interested in sustainable aviation fuel and really starting to step up to the plate. That's great to hear, to have that traction. I see some questions are starting to populate in the chat, so keep those coming. Before we jump into the question and answers, I'll ask whether or not we could do a go back, and if Alistar's presentation is available by a video, it'd be great to hear what Etihad's experience has been.
Hi, I'm Alistair Bullock, Head of Operations Strategy here at Etihad Airways. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for allowing me to participate in this webinar. And secondly, apologies for not being able to be there live. The time differences, of course, mean that in Abu Dhabi, this webinar is going to go out very early in the morning. But nonetheless, it's great to be able to sort of provide some perspectives from Etihad and from Abu Dhabi. So looking at the sort of sustainability goals that we have as an airline and the role that SAF plays in them, it's important to, I think, note that as the UAE's flag carrier, Etihad is 100% committed to sustainable aviation. This is something that we've been embarking on for a number of years now, and something that hasn't slowed down despite the pandemic, and is very much a strategic priority for us going forward. SAF plays a huge role in that, and a growing role, and we look to SAF to support more of our sustainability objectives, because we believe that the future airline is a sustainable one, and the airlines that neglect to advance their sustainability agenda will be very much left behind when the pandemic lifts and normality returns. So in terms of procuring SAF, we have good experience in working with SAF, although we would like to see it more widely available. With some of the work that we've done with Boeing on our delivery flights, most of those flights are coming most of those aircraft are coming to the UAE with tanks loaded with sustainable aviation fuel, and you know, as high as the percentages will allow, based upon sort of the operating requirements of the engines. We've also worked with Boeing as part of their Eco Demonstrator program towards the back end of 2020, where we helped Boeing take technologies out of the lab and into the air for the first time to test out their effectiveness. And all of this experimental flying was done with the maximum permittable blend of SAF, 50% SAF mixed with 50% regular Jet A1. And it was really good to be able to make that commitment to Boeing and their partners, World Energy and Epic, in order to support the delivery of that, which I believe was the largest commercially produced volume of SAF. Some of the challenges in terms of our experience of dealing with SAF is obviously its price, and SAF can be anything up to 4 times more expensive than regular Jet A1. And when you consider that fuel typically makes up 1/3 of an airline's cost, that is just a cost that's too high to bear should we be able to deploy SAF across our sort of entire operation. In terms of partnerships and other engagements, we are actually partnered with a number of companies here within the UAE. And while the UAE is an oil producing nation, it is also very much committed to the development of sustainable fuels, and reducing the reliance on oil, because obviously oil is not the future. So we're part of the Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium. Boeing are also part of that, along with Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and Khalifa University. And it's been great to be part of that consortium, because we've been able to trial projects looking at salt water tolerant plants used as a feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel. And so some of that fuel that's been produced here within Abu Dhabi, not at commercial scales, but just at sort of conceptual levels, has actually made its way into Etihad's aircraft and supported Etihad's operation. So I think following all of that, if I had to change one thing, well, I'd actually change 2, it would predominantly be access to SAF, because SAF is not available globally. We fly to around 70 destinations, and we cannot get SAF in all of those. And secondly, and probably more importantly, would be the price of SAF. As I said before, it's 4 times more expensive, which just makes it commercially very, very challenging for us to adopt SAF wholesale. Thank you very much for allowing me the chance to speak, and I look forward to seeing the outcome of the webinar.
All right, well, thanks for getting that video together for us. And yeah, I think that actually ties in very nicely to one of the questions that was in the chat for the supply folks, which is obviously airlines want SAF and suppliers want to make SAF, but there's a disconnect, and that disconnect comes around price, and you get stuck in that kind of paradox loop where until we can get economies of scale, the price will be high, but if people won't buy it until the cost comes down, you'll never get to scale, which kind of begs where government can step in. And so for the supply panel, I'll pose the question: government has lots of different levers it can pull from a variety of measures. What has been working best in your experience, either in region or elsewhere around the world, to help really kind of crack this nut?
I can start with that if you want. What works. The way we approach this is that the way we approach these contracts is that the actual fixed and variable cash costs are quite low for making products like ours. This is partly because we make enormous quantities of protein that act as a co-product that helps to offset things. But the way that we can make money and pay back capital is from getting the money back from the defossilization from the carbon. So most of the customers are focused on California with their LCFS policy. CARB has done an outstanding job of setting up a system that everyone can understand. Not everybody likes it fully, but it works really, really well at putting monetary value on carbon that we can go ahead and plan for. And people believe it's here for the long run. RFS also does the same thing. There's the blender's tax credit. There's some new bills. All those things matter, and it results in several dollars of carbon value per gallon, some of which we share with customers, and that helps offset their costs. So we'd expect our customers to have near parity on the price of the fuels. That's why we've been able to sell so much on take-or-pay contracts. In Europe, it's a different game. It depends on what, where, how. We've announced a project, Inspire Germany, and it's going to be it's all the same thing. You're counting the value from the defossilization. That's what makes the difference. And so I think that once plants are fully depreciated and paid off in capital, you know what? They'll compete with petrochemical stuff. That's reality already. And so you see it, these alcohol to jet routes that Jimmy was talking about and what we do, we think, we look at ethanol and isobutanols, they're alcohol to jets, same games apply. You got to decarbonize things. You do that, it's worth it. And it's economical, it's efficient. So we're at that cusp already of these things happening. And so that's why you see the growth potential unfolding.
Yeah, if I can add to that, agree with what Pat said. I think what we see across the globe, there's a lot of effort in different parts of the globe with mandates that are being put in place. That certainly is part of what needs to be happening. The other part is government support for scaling technologies and deploying technologies and getting them across, some of these thresholds where they become, much more economically viable and at parity, right? So we've been very successful with securing grants from governments to scale up our technology in the US and the UK and the European Union as well. As Pat mentioned, here in the United States, there are some great mechanisms, both at the national level and state levels, to balance a bit the cost of the fuels. I don't think, there was the video that we just watched indicated that fuels are 4x more expensive than conventional jet. I don't think that's always the case. That's not the case for us. I think even without the incentives, we're not anywhere near that 4x mark. But with the incentives in places like the US, it is quite helpful and quite attractive to airlines to use our fuels. Places like the UK have the renewable transport fuel obligation, another helpful mechanism to sort of add a benefit for reducing carbon. And that's part of the work that we've been doing in New Zealand with Scion and Z Energy and Air New Zealand and others. It's about putting in place a framework that we think can help not only send a strong signal that the country is interested in developing the industry, but is also there to support the development of the industry with some of the types of programs that I mentioned, whether it's tax credits or loan guarantees or other low carbon fuel standard type programs, as we've seen be successful elsewhere. So I think I agree with the point in terms of governments need to be involved, especially in these early days. I think governments that are stepping up and the markets that have that activity are seeing quite a bit of action, if you will, in terms of technologies being deployed and staff being used in those markets. Again, I'm encouraged by all that I'm seeing across the globe and hopeful for what's to come, I think, in New Zealand in particular.
And if I could just add to that, I absolutely agree with Patrick around the carbon price. Is going to be really important, and with Jimmy, I think sort of scale is key here, and learning how to improve the costs of these new technologies is going to be really important. Great examples from Brazil when they introduced the sugarcane to ethanol plant projects. Within 25 years, the cost of producing a litre of ethanol was 70% lower than when they first started doing it. That's real term reduction cost. And I think we also need to factor in somehow what are the benefits of some of the externalities, the benefits of regional economic development, particularly here in New Zealand. There's obviously would be huge benefits if we were producing our own biofuels here versus importing crude oil and converting them, or importing biofuels from Singapore. And also energy security and independence. What's the value of that? And for a small state like New Zealand, that could be incredibly important. So those are other factors that we need to consider.
Thanks, Stuart. That's a great discussion around kind of a good overview of all the different policies out there that what's working. David, did you have something you wanted to add?
Not too much, I guess, directly on policy, but what I have seen been very successful in some of our research work is groups like in Australia, the Grains Research and Development Corporation, some of these industry sectors coming together with some of the energy technology developers, I guess. And initially they're slightly different goals. We had a lot of work with ammonia, for example, as a hydrogen carrier. And of course, that comes from a sector where it's principally used in agriculture for fertilizers and in and explosives and things. So very important for the agriculture industry to look at it from how they're going to have sustainable fertilizers. But then before you know it, it becomes a much broader value chain, and their investment then, or their interest then, in other chains of how to connect that industry sector with the infrastructure, technology and know-how of the energy sector has seen them become much more involved in several other, I guess, opportunities, which has now led to some of these joint efforts on combining biomass with advanced electrolysis, for example, so we can enhance the the efficiency of the process, bringing renewable electricity and biomass conversion together. It's all about managing the stoichiometry to produce the product. So it certainly brought the connections into new industries, new technologies they didn't originally come to look at. So it's bringing those different sectors together is absolutely key, and the industry bodies, the industry groups, are a really good vehicle to do that. They'd not before ever worked with the petroleum sector, and they certainly hadn't worked with the electrolysis and the emerging hydrogen sector. So to us, bringing those industry groups together and then trying to provide infrastructure, and the government's doing that through encouraging technology development hubs in certain regional areas. In North Queensland now, around Gladstone, there's one, and of course that's Gladstone, Bundaberg, a strong sugar growing area, so that brings that industry much closer to some of these potential export and local uses. Tasmania, similarly, very strong hydro resources, now looking at working with the ammonia industry and the hydrogen sector, and of course the forestry industry there. So carbon-based fuels with hydro-based electricity becomes a really nice pathway. So to me, those encouragement, I guess, of these industry hubs or these technology hubs is doing a lot to bringing the different sectors together, get their scale. They don't have to reinvent the wheel, and the infrastructure provides a bit of a leap over that barrier to entry of everybody having to create all the safety and all of the other things that go around doing the R&D to prove up some of these technologies.
I'm gonna add something to what David said. He hit it spot on. It's about the big business system. You have to think really big if we're going to drive the cost out and drive the carbon scores down and make them even negative. You got to think of the whole thing. So when you look at a little company like us, we're doing wind development, biogas development, hydrogen. We're building those things along with making hydrocarbons. We're also involved in the agriculture side, incentivizing farmers to capture soil carbon. We're also doing sequestration activities. And the thing is, that works right there in the Midwest. And we'll do something. If it was in Australia, I'd be going right to David and say, David, let's put all the ideas on the table and let's go do the same thing. And that's how you create the lowest cost systems overall. A little more complex to think about in terms of business system. It's not simply a products offered game. You got to think the whole of it and its whole sustainability and how to address it. And I totally agree that that's how it'll unfold, because there's all kinds of little things to add value and lower cost through the business systems when you're doing that.
Yeah, and key stepping stones just to get started. It doesn't start purely green, but boy, there's a great platform there on the fossil-based industry, or even the used oil regeneration for hydrogenating with renewable hydrogen, bringing in the biomass where it didn't have that pathway before, and that's benefit for the big guys who are already there. It's a transition pathway, and it's a great stepping stone for the new technologies to sort of start to find their connections.
Great discussion. So I want to switch gears a little bit to a question that was rolling around. So at least here in North America, especially with folks like Amazon and the Breakthrough Institute, green bonds have really been kind of in the public eye. I just saw a news flash went by that last year in 2020, the green bond market topped $1 trillion. So curious to get this panel's view is what role, if any, would green bonds do in helping to finance and really bring some of these ideas to market quicker?
Well, I can tell you from our point of view, when we build our net zero plant, it's going to have, of course, making hydrocarbons. It'll have the fermentation chemistry plant. It'll have a water treatment plant, a biogas plant, a related wind project. It'll have a big hydrogen plant along with it. Total capital cost, fully installed basis, fully financed at a project level, $800 million plus. That'll be done with PABs, tax exempt PABs bonds, and probably green. We just did a green bond financing for a renewable natural gas project starts with 20,000 head of cattle to turn manure into biogas. And so it's definitely something that's there, but it's very much in the early days that people are still trying to sort out what does it all mean and how do you know these things are real? And there aren't that many projects to invest in that are large, that are ready to go for prime time commercialization. We happen to be lucky in that we're in a position to take advantage of those things and we're at a size where it matters. So we're already pretty sure, Citigroup is sure, they're working with us, they're sure that we can get her done. And of course, we already have the equity on the balance sheet, so we can go ahead. We see that there's lots of appetite for this investment. We're involved in these discussions every single day of our lives. It's primarily what I do in my job nowadays, is educate people as to what's possible. And it is this whole thing of the renewable energy thing that we were just talking about that intrigues people. They get it. If you our whole fossil-based problem, the vast majority of the fossil-based problem is all about the burning fossil carbon for electricity, burning it for heat, burning it for fuel. Get rid of those things, you can solve problems.
Yeah, and if I can add, I think there's certainly viability there. We haven't had the need yet to explore tapping into green bonds and using that as a mechanism. We've got a good set of investors who are actively supporting us on the scale up of our technology in the U.S. and abroad. So I'm encouraged that they're playing a role and that there is that availability. For us, it hasn't been a need quite yet in terms of tapping into them.
Sure. Looking at the clock there, I think we're just about on time, which is great. So there's a few things left to do. One is, and first most, is to thank all the panelists for your time today. I think this is a great discussion. I think we probably just scratched the tip of the iceberg, which is great, because I think many more of these conversations need to happen. And I think, as everyone has mentioned, the momentum is there. It's just a matter of keeping the conversation going and identifying those opportunities. So once again, thank you on behalf of myself and on behalf of Safans, and then I'll turn it over to Georgina for any closing statements.
Hang on. Sorry, everyone. I'm multitasking a little bit with a child with gastro. So the joys of being a mother and working in lockdown in Victoria. But thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Mark, for doing such a wonderful job of curating, suggesting speakers and helping coordinate. And of course, hosting the conversation today and managing the questions. You did really well. Thank you to all our presenters and speakers. This conversation will be loaded onto our YouTube site in the coming days. So we will send out an email when that is live. Feel free to share it with all your networks.